Can you see me and can you hear me, please? Okay. I hope you can hear me clearly. If you have any problem, I will just talk. Okay. I hope it is clear now. So today we are going to talk about a new topic, and that is central nervous system. Central nervous system. Before we talk about central nervous system, there are certain peculiarities regarding CNS. Number one, you can make a note of it. The peculiarities with CNS. Whenever we discuss about diseases regarding CNS, we must keep in our mind that these are the peculiarities related to CNS. Number one, physical restriction to expand. Physical restriction to expand. Remember that brain is within a hard cache of bone. So whenever any disease which expands the brain mass or the content of the world is increased, there is little room for its expansion. Suppose you have an injury to your leg, there is a lot of room for the expansion. But this is not in the case of central nervous system. The brain cannot expand beyond its limit because of physical restriction to expand. Number two, the brain is a permanent tissue. Brain is a permanent tissue. Once you lose a part of the brain, once you lose the neurons of the brain, they cannot be regenerated. They cannot be regenerated. Like in the heart, heart is a permanent tissue. If you lose a piece of heart, it is lost forever. In healing and repair, this lost part of the heart is replaced by a scar, by connective tissue. Likewise, if you have injury to the brain, and if you lose some of the neurons or a segment of the brain, it will not be replaced again because it cannot regenerate, and it will always be replaced by glial tissue. In other part of the body, it is fibrous tissue. But in the brain, if you lose a part of brain, it is always replaced by glial tissue. If you remember, if you lose any tissue, It is occupied by granulation tissue consisting of proliferating fibroblasts and blood vessels. But in case of brain, a lost tissue is replaced by glial tissue, proliferation of glial tissue, and that is called gliosis. This is second peculiarity whenever you talk about CNS. The third peculiarity is that every specific part of the brain has got a specific function, particular function. If you lose that group of neurons, that function is lost. Remember, whenever there is a brain injury, whenever there is a disease of the brain, there is an injury, you have vulnerability to lose group of neurons, and those group of neurons are very specific for a particular activity. Once that is lost, once that part is lost, you lose the specific activity of the brain. Suppose a part of the brain is related to the motor activity of hand. If that is lost, the person will have permanent loss of function of the hand. It means that you have any disease of the brain. You have any disease of the brain. It may be associated with neurological deficit. Neurological deficit. So this is the third peculiarity regarding CNS. Number 4, you must remember that there is no lymphatic channels in the CNS. Throughout the body, you have lymphatic channels. But in case of CNS, you do not have lymphatic channels. Now, these 4 peculiarities are very important whenever you are talking about CNS. Again, I repeat, number 1, that every small part of the brain or localized part of the brain is concerned with its special function. If that is lost, you are going to develop neurological deficit. If that part of the brain is related to your vision, if you lose that part, you have lost the vision. That is called neurological deficit. If you are clinically good, if you have good clinical acumen, if you have good clinical acumen, by clinical examination of CNS, you can determine where is the lesion in the brain. That is why the most important part of clinical neurology is to be able to assess the neurological deficit by clinical examination. Number 2, the CNS is a permanent tissue. Once a part of the CNS is lost, it is always lost forever. It is lost forever. and the lost tissue is replaced by glial tissue. That is called gliosis. Number three, that number three peculiarity regarding CNS is its physical restriction to expand. And number four, that there are no lymphatics in the central nervous system. Anyway, I hope you must have noted it down. Let us talk about what happens when central nervous system is diseased by any disease, whether it is trauma, whether it is hypoxia, whether it is bacterial viral infection, whether it is a genetic disease, whether it is storage disease, whatever disease, whether it is a tumor, whatever it is, it presents with clinical manifestation. And that is very important, that one must be able to appreciate the clinical manifestation of any CNS disorder. The most important effect of any disease in CNS is number one. I hope you are making a note of it. Any disease of CNS will eventually result into number one, neurological deficit. Neurological deficit. Number two, raised or increased intracranial pressure. Increase intracranial pressure. Whatever disease you have in the brain, eventually they lead to neurological deficit. And number two, increase intracranial pressure. Mind it, the most important function of the brain is awareness, consciousness. The most important function of the brain is consciousness. Likewise, most important function of an eye is vision. Whenever you have injury to eye, there is loss of function. This loss of function might be mild, moderate, or severe. If somebody has got a disease of an eye, he may be blind, or he may be having some difficulty to visualize. There is a spectrum of loss of function. Whenever there is a disease of any tissue, it is always associated with loss of function. Depending upon the severity of a disease, you have a spectrum of loss of function. If you break your leg, what will happen? You will not be able to play football. You will not be able to run. Likewise, if you have a disease of CNS, you must keep in mind that the most important function is consciousness, awareness. Now, there are a spectrum of loss of consciousness. There are a spectrum of loss of consciousness. Consciousness means you are aware about your surrounding. For example, the extreme of loss of consciousness, remember, the extreme of loss of consciousness is blackout. In the bracket, coma. You sleep. This is the extreme of loss of consciousness. Blackout. Somebody hits you on your head with a hammer, what will happen? You fall down. Blackout. You go into coma. That is the extreme loss of function of the brain. But there are degrees of loss of consciousness. You may have loss of consciousness about your surrounding. Suppose you are sitting in a classroom. If you are asked, gentlemen, where are you sitting? If you are a normal person, you will answer, sir, I am in the class. But if you have loss of consciousness about your surrounding, you may say, I am sitting in mosque. I am sitting in my bedroom. That means that the person has got loss of awareness about his surrounding. There is loss of awareness about time and space. If you ask somebody, hello, can you hear me please? Okay, buddy. If you ask somebody, is it day or night? He may label a day as night. The person may have loss of awareness to his relatives. He may not be able to recognize father. He may not be able to recognize mother or son or daughters. Or he may have some behavioral changes. That is also part of loss of consciousness. He may be a grandeur. He may develop a grandiosity. Grandiosity means that false believing of being something big. For example, among you, if somebody says, I'm going to the sea to feed the fishes, they are waiting for me. This is grandiosity. Or I am the king, or sky is weeping for me. This is grandiosity. Or etc. etc. Anyway, so we are talking about the clinical manifestation of CNS diseases, loss of consciousness, seizure, convulsion is another manifestation of CNS diseases. Now, the most important part of CNS disorder is raised intracranial pressure. Means that the intracranial pressure is very high because of limited accommodation. The common causes of raised intracranial pressure are number one, brain edema. And of course, later on you talk about causes of brain edema. Number two, hydrocephalus. That will lead to raised intracranial pressure. Hydrocephalus means that you have excessive CSF. Number three is hemorrhage, which will complicate into raised intracranial pressure. Number four, any expanding mass. The most important is the tumors of CNS. You know that any tumor, it is rapidly proliferating. So since you have little accommodation, it will lead to increased intracranial pressure. So at least we have more important four causes of raised intracranial pressure. Brain edema, number one. Hydrocephalus, number two. And brain tumors are either primary brain tumors or metastatic brain tumors. Now, what are the effect of intracranial pressure? Let me tell you, this is a life-threatening condition. Raised intracranial pressure is a life-threatening condition. You have to identify it as a doctor that a person is having raised intracranial pressure. It is mandatory to identify. Otherwise, the person is going to die. What are the effects of raised intracranial pressure? When you have increased intracranial pressure, it compresses the brain matter, number one. Whenever you have raised intracranial pressure, it compresses the brain matter. Number two, whenever you have increased intracranial pressure, the blood vessels within the skulls are compressed. The blood vessels within the skull, whether they are on the surface of the brain, whether they are within the brain matter, they get compressed. And of course, the vessels, when they are compressed, it will lead to brain ischemia. And number three, herniation. So remember, intracranial pressure is an emergency. You have to identify it clinically so that you can think of managing it. And it is a life-saving management. If you don't identify raised intracranial pressure, what is going to happen? Number one, the raised intracranial pressure will lead to compression of brain. Number two, it will lead to compression of blood vessel, leading to ischemia, both conditions leading to ischemia. Number three, herniation. There are three types of herniation within the skull. One is called cingulate herniation. If you go through the book, you have beautiful pictures. Number two, uncinate herniation. That is called transtentorial herniation. And number three is tonsillar herniation. I repeat it again, subfalcine or cingulate herniation. Subfalcine or cingulate herniation. Number two, transtentorial or uncinate herniation. And third one is tonsillar herniation, that is seen in foramen magnum. So these are the three effects of raised intracranial pressure. And these are all life-threatening. So clinically, how do you identify raised intracranial pressure? Number one, severe headache. If somebody is complaining of severe headache, you must exclude raised intracranial pressure. Of course, there are 101 causes of headache, but one of them, the most important and life-threatening, is raised intracranial pressure. So headache, diplopia, that is because of if somebody has got raised intracranial pressure, the optic nerve is surrounded by meninges. That pressure is submitted to the optic nerve. Within the optic nerve, you have blood vessels, especially veins. These veins are compressed and the person will develop papilloedema. So person having raised intracranial pressure, he will have problem in the vision. Diplopia, haziness of vision, and this can be clinically determined by examining the optic disc. When you examine the optic disc, you will find papilloedema. That means that the person has got confirmed raised intracranial pressure. Besides that, the person having raised intracranial pressure will have vomiting, excessive vomiting. It is a common observation when somebody has got trauma of the skull, and if they are having vomiting, we always suspect that the person is developing raised intracranial pressure. Besides that, if you check the pulse of that person clinically, you will find bradycardia. And that is because of vasovagal stimulation. Again, I repeat, clinically, the person will give you history of severe headache, difficulty in the vision. When you examine the optic nerve disc, you will find papilloedema, vomiting, bradycardia, and beside that, the person may have a degree of loss of awareness. He may have behavior changes. He may be grandeur. He may be subconscious, or he may have, depending upon the cause of raised intracranial pressure, he may have seizure or convulsion. The idea of recognizing raised intracranial pressure is to decrease it by your management. And meanwhile, you look for the main cause of raised intracranial pressure. In our society, in our setup, the most important cause of raised intracranial pressure are external trauma, head injury, head injury. Besides that, you may have infection like meningitis, you may have brain abscess, or you may have tumors. Right. So we are talking about raised intracranial pressure. I already mentioned about the causes of raised intracranial pressure. Brain edema, number one, due to any inflammatory disease of the brain. Hydrocephalus means that increase in the volume of CSF, hemorrhage, either because of the trauma or rupture of the vessel due to hypertension or aneurysm. We will talk in detail later on. Or raised intracranial pressure is because of any expanding mass. The most important is the tumor, whether it is primary or it is secondary. We have talked about the effect of intracranial pressure, that is compression of the brain, compression of the blood vessel, herniation. All these leading into infarction of the brain. Let us talk about hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus means that there is increased CSF in your ventricular system and in your subarachnoid space. That will lead to increased intracranial pressure. Hydrocephalus, normally when you look at the ventricles, there are two lateral ventricles. There are two lateral ventricles. Number two, these two lateral ventricles, they are lined by ependymal epithelium. And beneath the ependymal lining epithelium, you have choroid plexus. Your CSF fluid is formed there. Then it comes into lateral ventricles. Through lateral ventricles, they drain into third ventricle. They drain into third ventricle through a foramina called foramen Monro. Foramen Monro. So whatever CSF is formed, it comes into lateral ventricle, accumulates into lateral ventricle, and through lateral ventricle it is drained into third ventricle via a foramen called foramen Monro. After third ventricle, it goes into fourth ventricle, which is in brain, which is in medulla oblongata, fourth ventricle. The communication between third ventricle and fourth ventricle is called cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct. And then this fluid from fourth ventricle is drained into subarachnoid space. The CSF fluid is drained into subarachnoid space from fourth ventricle by two foramina, foramina lusca and foramina magendii. Once the fluid comes into subarachnoid space, it is drained into venous circulation by arachnoid granulation. It is a particular structure which invaginates into venous channels in sinuses, which contains the blood, and the CSF is drained into venous blood through a particular structure called arachnoid granulation. So this is a very short orientation about the ventricles. There are two lateral ventricles, third ventricle and fourth ventricle. Two lateral ventricles that drain CSF into third ventricle by a foramina called foramina Monro, and by two foramina, the fluid, CSF fluid in third ventricle is drained into fourth ventricle by cerebral aqueduct, and fluid from fourth ventricle is drained into subarachnoid space by two foramina called foramina lusca, which is found in the roof of the fourth ventricle, and foramina magendii. These foramina lusca and magendii will drain CSF into subarachnoid space. And from subarachnoid space, the fluid is drained into venous circulation by a special structure called arachnoid granulation. Hydrocephalus is basically of three types. Hydrocephalus, remember, A very important cause of raised intracranial pressure is of three types. One is called non-communicating hydrocephalus. Non-communicating hydrocephalus. It means that there is obstruction somewhere in ventricular system. When we say non-communicating or obstructive hydrocephalus, it means that there is an element of obstruction in ventricular system. This obstruction might be at the level of foramina Monroe, at the level of cerebral aqueduct. These are the two important parts. And most of the time, certain tumors, they compress and they cause obstruction. So whenever a person develops hydrocephalus, you must determine whether it is non-communicating, means that obstructive hydrocephalus. If it is obstructive hydrocephalus, then there is an element of obstruction somewhere in ventricular system. There is another type of hydrocephalus that is called communicating or non-obstructive hydrocephalus. When we say communicating hydrocephalus, means that there is no obstruction in the ventricular system, but the problem is the reabsorption of CSF in subarachnoid space into venous circulation. It means that problem is somewhere in arachnoid granulation. And it is very easy to determine if somebody has got hydrocephalus. It is very easy to determine by it's very easy to determine by X-ray, CT scan. CT scan will tell you whether it is communicating or non-communicating. When it is non-communicating hydrocephalus, means it is obstructive hydrocephalus. On CT scan, you will see that the ventricular system is not completely dilated. Only part of the ventricular system is dilated because of accumulation of CSF. For example, aqueduct of cerebrum is blocked. So you will find that the third ventricle is dilated and the lateral ventricles are dilated. If it is communicating hydrocephalus, you will see that all the ventricles are uniformly there is no obstruction in ventricular system. I hope you understand. Hydrocephalus is of two types, communicating in the bracket, non-obstructive hydrocephalus. Second type is non-communicating in the bracket, obstructive hydrocephalus. There is another type of hydrocephalus in which CSF fluid is increased, but it is without any clinical significance, and it is called compensatory hydrocephalus. It means that if you lose part of your brain matter, it will lead to increased CSF fluid, and in CT scan you have to determine that it is not communicating or non-communicating hydrocephalus, it is compensatory hydrocephalus. Even in old age, if somebody has got brain atrophy, CT scan will show the element of hydrocephalus, but it is without any clinical significance. It does not raise the intracranial pressure. Right. Now we talk about brain edema, another cause of raised intracranial pressure. You already know and you have studied the pathophysiology of edema. Edema is either extravascular or interstitial edema, या intercellular edema, or you can have cellular edema that indicates the injury of the cell. Whenever cell is injured, you have cellular edema. In most of the cases, whether it is trauma, whether it is infection, whether it is the brain abscess, it is associated with edema. Besides that, you can have edema when you have hyponatremia. One can develop brain edema when is osmotic plasma osmotic pressure is decreased. Now we will talk about the specific diseases of the CNS. Right now, I will just introduce you, and in next lecture, tomorrow, we will talk everything in detail. The infection of meninges. Number 2, infection of brain matter. When we say infection of meninges, it is called meningitis. When we say inflammation of the brain matter, it is called encephalitis. It is called encephalitis. Meningitis, again, it is something very serious, and every doctor must know what is meningitis because it is a life-threatening condition. I told you one of the most important complication of meningitis is raised intracranial pressure, and in turn intracranial pressure is going to cause ischemia of the brain because of the compression of the vessel and the brain matter, and one can develop herniation. Anyway, meningitis. We can classify meningitis on the basis of inflammation. Yes, on the basis of type of inflammation. Acute meningitis and chronic meningitis. We can also classify meningitis on the basis of etiology. Bacterial meningitis. The cause of the inflammation of meninges are bacteria. Viral meningitis. The cause is a virus. You can have meningitis because of the irritation by tumor metastasis. You can have meningitis by protozoal infection of the meninges. Like malaria, like Entamoeba histolytica. You can have fungal meningitis. But the most important meningitis is bacterial meningitis. The most important meningitis is bacterial meningitis. Note it down, and often it is asked, what are the common bacteria or important bacteria which cause bacterial meningitis? The most important, and often they lead to epidemic meningitis. Remember, meningococci, Neisseria meningococcus. Number 2, Streptococcus pneumoniae. These two are very important bacteria which often cause epidemic in society. Streptococcus pneumoniae is also called pneumococci. The second name of Streptococcus pneumoniae is pneumococci. Streptococcus pneumoniae or pneumococci are gram-positive diplococci, and Neisseria meningitis is gram-negative diplococci. These two bacteria, they will cause meningitis in adults, and often they cause epidemic meningitis. In neonates, the bacteria which cause meningitis are E. coli, and Streptococcus. The basic reason of their having meningitis is there is an infection in the birth canal. So these neonates, they can develop meningitis by these two bacteria, E. coli and Streptococcus. In adult, if you have meningitis, you can always think of Streptococcus pneumoniae and Neisseria meningitis. There is another bacteria, I cannot recall its name right now, influenza. If somebody of you know the name, उसके आगे इन्फ्लुएंजा आता है, अगर किसी को पता है तो बताए. You can write it down. Anyway, I will let you know later on in the class. Another most important bacteria which is responsible for meningitis, but it causes chronic meningitis, and that is Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Yes, Haemophilus influenza, yes. Haemophilus influenza is one of the bacteria which causes meningitis in young children. Yes. Okay, thank you very much. Who did it? Adika Salim. Acha, Adika. Very good. There is another one, Hira. There is another one, Zoha. Oh, you are well aware of it. So again I repeat, bacterial meningitis, the important bacteria are, I just mentioned, acute bacterial meningitis is caused by pneumococci. They are also called Streptococcus pneumoniae. Neisseria meningitis, number 2. E. coli, number 3. Streptococcus, number 4. And this one, Haemophilus influenza, number 5. And the most important bacteria which causes chronic meningitis is Mycobacterium tuberculosis. The point is how these bacteria, they reach to your meninges. The most important route for bacteria to reach to your meninges is hematological route. It means that the bacteria, they first come into your circulation, they cause bacteremia, and then via circulation, they go to meninges. And that is why people who develop pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia, they may complicate into meningitis. This is one route. Second route, if somebody has got infection by these bacteria in the nose, having sinusitis and otitis media and inflammation of mastoid, they may have simply extension of the bacteria into the meninges. This is second route. The third route is trauma. If somebody has a trauma and it is contaminated with bacteria, they can develop meningitis. I think it is enough for today. Inshallah, we will talk in detail about meningitis tomorrow on the same time. Yes. Okay, we call it a day now.